There are places on this earth that do not belong to the living. Places where the sky presses down like a stone, where the wind does not whisper, it screams, and the silence between gusts is somehow worse than the screaming. Places where light arrives cold and leaves colder, and every shadow holds the temperature of a grave. The Andes Mountains are such a place. They rise from the western spine of South America like the remnants of some ancient violence, a geological wound that never fully closed. At their highest reaches, the air thins to the point where thought itself slows, where every breath is a negotiation, where the body, stripped of its warmth and certainty, begins to understand, perhaps for the first time, how extraordinary it is simply to be alive. It is October 1972, and somewhere inside those mountains, a plane has just disappeared. The world that boarded Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 on the morning of October 12, 1972, was not the world of survival manuals and wilderness training. It was a world of rugby jerseys and rosary beads, of young men in their 20s who had never once considered how they might die, only how they might live, laugh, and play. 45 people were aboard, 40 passengers and 5 crew, mostly members of the Old Christians Club rugby team from Montevideo, young, Catholic, educated, boys really. Boys in the bodies of men, carrying with them the golden, ordinary weight of everything they had yet to do. Some brought books, some brought cards. One young man had recently become engaged. Another had promised his mother. He would call as soon as they landed in Santiago. The flight was routine, the kind of crossing that was done so often it had stopped feeling like anything at all. But the Andes do not care about routine. The pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Dante Laguerra, made a navigation error in judgment that would alter history. Believing they had already cleared the highest peaks, he began his descent toward Santiago. He had misread the cloud cover below. The terrain beneath was not the foothills of Chile. It was still the heart of the mountain range. The passengers felt the turbulence first, the violent, stomach-dropping lurching of a plane suddenly out of its element, then the screaming of the engines as the pilots fought for altitude they could not reach. Some passengers prayed. Some gripped the armrests until their knuckles went white. Some simply closed their eyes, as though the darkness behind their eyelids might somehow be safer than the darkness outside the window. Then the right wing struck the first ridge. It sheared off like paper. And then the left wing. And then the plane, now a broken metal tube hurtling at nearly 300 kilometers per hour, carved its way through the snow of a glacier called Glacier de las Lágrimas, the Glacier of Tears. The name, as if the mountain had known. Silence, the kind that follows catastrophe, the kind that lasts only a second but stretches in memory across a lifetime. Then sound returned, the groaning of twisted metal, the hiss of something burning, the wind, always the wind, threading through the wreckage with a cold indifference that felt almost cruel. Those who could move did not immediately understand that they were alive. Survival is not a thought that arrives quickly. It arrives slowly in fragments, first as sensation, then as confusion, then as something approaching terror. 28 people had survived the initial impact. 12 had not. The dead lay scattered in the snow alongside luggage, torn upholstery, rosary beads, and rugby cleats. At an altitude of approximately 3,600 meters, nearly 12,000 feet, with no shelter, no proper clothing, no food, and no understanding of where exactly they were, those 28 survivors looked out at a landscape so alien and so merciless that several of them later said the same thing. They thought they had died, and this was somewhere else entirely. In the hours that followed, the survivors did what human beings have always done at the edge of extinction. They organized. Roberto Canessa, a 19-year-old medical student, became the de facto physician. He assessed injuries with hands that trembled, not from fear, though fear was certainly present, but from cold. The temperature was already dropping toward minus 20 Celsius as night approached. The mountain does not wait for the living to collect themselves. They stripped seats from the fuselage and used them as insulation. They carried the injured inside the broken tail of the aircraft. They ate the small portions of chocolate and wine that had survived the crash. and they rationed it with a precision that betrayed how quickly they understood. This was not a matter of hours. This was not something a search party would resolve by morning. The first night on that glacier was a thing of pure, undiluted terror. The cold that descended was not the cold of winter evenings or mountain hikes. It was the cold of geological deep time, the cold of a place that had not been warm since before human memory. It crept through every layer of clothing. It entered through the breath. It worked its way into the space behind the eyes. Several men wept quietly in the dark. Several prayed. One survivor later recalled that he spent the entire first night simply repeating his own name, not to anyone, just to himself, as though naming himself over and over was the only way to remain real. For 10 days, the survivors waited. They had heard the search planes overhead on the second and third day, their engines distant, almost dreamlike. They had waved. They had spelled out signals in the snow. They had screamed into the sky with everything left in their lungs. But they wore white, and they lay in white, and the fuselage was white, and the mountains swallowed their voices before they reached anyone. On day 10, a survivor who had managed to repair a small transistor radio made a discovery that changed everything, and nothing simultaneously. He heard a broadcast. The search had been called off. The Uruguayan and Chilean search and rescue operations had concluded that no one could have survived. The terrain was too extreme, the altitude too unforgiving, the weather too violent. The search aircraft had swept the area 17 times and found nothing. The world had decided they were dead. Nando Pardue heard this and said nothing for a very long time. He sat in the half-dark of the broken fuselage, his mother already gone, his sister dying from her injuries, and he let the weight of those words settle into his bones like the cold. Then he stood up. The decision that followed was not heroic in the way that word is usually used. It was not the decision of a man who felt invincible. It was a decision of a man who felt absolutely, completely mortal and chose to move anyway. But before Pardue could move, the mountain struck again. On the 16th night, as the survivors slept huddled together in the fuselage, an avalanche rolled down the glacier and buried the wreckage. 8 more people died in their sleep, suffocated by snow. The survivors who remained, now numbering 16, spent the night packed inside a white tomb, breathing the thinning air in shallow, controlled gasps, waiting to find out if the snow would release them or keep them forever. When morning came, they dug their way out with their hands. 16 people, 16 heartbeats, against a mountain that had already taken 29. There is a moment in the history of this event that history books record plainly, factually, in a single sentence. It deserves more than a sentence. Days into their ordeal, the precise day debated, the exact moment loss of privacy of desperate human conscience, the survivors face a decision that no ethical framework, no religious doctrine, no philosophical tradition had truly prepared them for. The food was gone, not depleted, not running low, gone. They were at high altitude, burning thousands of calories simply to maintain body temperature. Around them, preserved by the very cold that was killing them, were the bodies of those who had not survived the crash. The Catholic faith was the bedrock of nearly every person in that fuselage. To consume human flesh, the flesh of their friends, their teammates, the father of one young man, was not merely taboo. It was, in their theology, a profound and shattering transgression. And yet, Roberto Canessa, the medical student, framed it this way, not with coldness, but with the measured clarity of a young man trying desperately to make the unbearable into something survivable. If our friends could speak to us now, what would they say? They would say, use what remains of us. Live. It was not a decision made lightly. It was not made without tears. It was not made without prayer, without anguish, without long and tormented silence. But it was made, and it is the reason any of them are alive today. History must hold this moment without flinching, not with sensationalism, not with judgment, but with a deep and humble acknowledgement that these were human beings doing the only thing they had left, choosing life in the most impossible of circumstances. This was not savagery. It was sacrifice received, and honored. The weeks that followed were a slow, grinding war of attrition between 16 young men and a glacier that wanted to be alone. They established rituals, routines, a daily structure that sounds almost ordinary when listed. Wake at dawn, melt snow for water using a makeshift aluminum trough, eat measured portions, occupy the remaining hours with conversation, prayer, memory. But these rituals were not ordinary. They were the architecture of sanity built on the edge of nothing. Some men became engineers, fashioning tools from the wreckage, aluminum struts repurposed into walking poles, seat covers transformed into sleeping bags. Others became doctors, tending frostbitten limbs and infected wounds with the limited supplies they could salvage. And all of them, in one way or another, became philosophers. They talked about God, not the God of comfort and convention, but the raw, terrible God of unmediated existence. They talked about their families with the desperate tenderness of people who understood that love, when stripped of everything else, is the only thing that remains. They talked about what they would do if they got out. If, the word that lived in every sentence, unspoken but omnipresent. Nando Pardue did not speak much during those weeks. Those who knew him before the crash described him as jovial, easygoing, unremarkable in the specific way that very happy people often are. The crash had killed his mother on impact. His sister Susie had lingered for 8 days after the crash before dying in his arms. What the mountain made of Nando Pardue was something different, quieter, more concentrated, as though grief had burned away everything superfluous and left only a core of something immovable. He spent those weeks studying the mountains, memorizing ridgelines, calculating distances with his eyes. He had no experience as a mountaineer. He had no training. What he had was a particular clarity that comes to a man who has already lost what he loved most and has decided, with absolute conviction, that he will not also lose himself. He asked Roberto Canessa, also 19, also untrained, to attempt the crossing with him. Canessa, who understood better than almost anyone the physiological reality of what Pardue was proposing, said yes. A third man, Antonio Vizintin, would accompany them for the first part of the journey, then turn back to preserve resources. On December 12, 1972, 61 days after the crash, the three men began walking into the mountains. The scale of what confronted them cannot be fully comprehended from a distance. The peak they needed to cross, which they had been watching for weeks, calculating and recalculating, rose to approximately 5,000 meters, nearly 16,500 feet, with no climbing equipment beyond improvised crampons fashioned from seat covers and metal, with no high-altitude clothing, with a physical condition already devastated by 2 months of near starvation. The first day, they climbed for hours and looked back to find the fuselage still clearly visible below them. Barely any distance at all. The mountain had made a fool of their expectations. The second day was worse. And the third day, standing on the summit, gasping in air so thin it felt like breathing through glass, what Pardue saw on the other side stopped his heart. Not a green valley, descending toward civilization. Not the foothills of Chile. More mountains, endless, white and silent and indifferent, extending to horizon in every direction. He later said he stood there for a long time, that he understood in that moment that the rational choice, the measured, reasonable choice, was to turn back, that any sane assessment of their situation made continuation not brave but suicidal. He turned to Canessa. "I see no alternative," he said. "We go down." They descended into a world of increasing warmth and decreasing oxygen deprivation, day by day, step by uncertain step, living on the last of the food Vizintin had returned to them before turning back, drinking from streams fed by snowmelt, their bodies, starved and frostbitten and improbable, carrying them forward through sheer insistence of will. On the 9th day of their trek, on December 20th, they reached the Rio Ajafer, and beside the river they found a man, a Chilean arriero, a cattle herder, named Sergio Catalan. He looked at them across the river. 2 young men, skeletal and sunburned and wild-eyed, dressed in rags and makeshift gear, standing on a far bank of a rushing mountain river. He had no way of knowing what they were, no frame of reference for what he was looking at. He threw them bread, Pardue, unable to shout across the water, found a pen in his pocket, tore a strip of paper from a bag, wrote a message and tied it to a stone, which he threw across the river to Catalan. The message read, "I come from a plane that fell in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. I have a friend injured up there. In the plane, there are still 14 injured people. We have to get out of here quickly, and we don't know how. We have no food. We are weak. When are you going to come?" Catalan read it. He looked up at the two figures across the water. He looked back down at the note. Then he mounted his horse and rode. He rode without stopping for 10 hours. The rescue operation that followed was swift and overwhelming. Military helicopters, medical teams, international news coverage flooding in from every direction. The world, which had declared these people dead, now watched in stunned disbelief as they emerged from the mountains one by one. 14 survivors remained at the crash site when the helicopters arrived. 14 people who had spent 72 days on a glacier at nearly 12,000 feet, surviving on what they had, on who they were, on the sheer collective stubbornness of human attachment to life. The reunion footage, grainy, saturated with particular quality of 1970s film stock, is almost unbearable to watch. Not because of the physical condition of the survivors, though that is striking, but because of the expressions on their faces. Relief is not quite the word, nor is joy exactly. It is something older than both. Something that exists in the part of the human face that is connected directly to the soul, bypassing language entirely. It is the expression of people who went somewhere that should have been one way, and came back. The press, when the story broke fully, did not know how to hold it. The survival itself, 16 people alive after 72 days, was extraordinary enough, but the how of their survival, once revealed, fractured the comfortable moral certainties of the world that received them. The survivors were met with a spectrum of responses that said more about the people responding than about the survivors themselves. Some called them heroes. Some called them sinners. The Vatican, notably, was measured. A theologian speaking on behalf of the church noted that the act of consuming the dead to preserve the living was not, in theological terms, an act of desecration, but an act of communion, a sharing of life across the boundary of death. The survivors themselves, many of whom had spent weeks wrestling in private anguish with the spiritual implications of what they had done, received this not as absolution, but as recognition. They had not needed to be forgiven. They had needed to be understood. Nando Pardue, in interviews conducted years later, spoke about this with the calm of a man who had long since made his peace. He said something that has stayed in the consciousness of everyone who has heard it. "I did not survive because I was strong or because I was smart. I survived because I refused to stop. Every day on that mountain, I told myself, one more step, just one more step, one more step." It sounds simple when extracted from context. When placed back into the context of 72 days on a glacier at 4 kilometers altitude, with no food, no warmth, no certainty, no end in sight, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a philosophy, a practice, a theology of its own. In the decades that followed, the survivors lived what survivors always live. The complicated, beautiful, heavy gift of a life that was almost not. Roberto Canessa became a pediatric cardiologist. He has spent his adult life repairing the hearts of children, thousands of them. There is a circularity to this that feels almost designed, though of course it was not. Nando Pardue became a television personality and businessman. In Uruguay, he married, had children, built a life of such deliberate richness and presence that it reads almost as a statement. He has spoken about the crash throughout his life not as something that defines him, but as something that clarified him, burned away the noise and showed him the signal. Fernando Paez became a farmer, a man who climbed out of the sky and chose to stay close to the ground. Others built businesses, raised families, became doctors, architects, teachers. They have reunions. Every year, still, some of them gather, ordinary men in their 70s now, with gray hair and grandchildren. And at those gatherings, if you look closely, if you know what you're looking at, you can still see it. That thing in the eyes. That particular quality of presence that belongs only to people who have stood at the absolute edge of existence and chosen, deliberately, to step back. The Andes still hold their dead. The bodies of those who were lost, the ones who died in the crash, in the avalanche, who could not be saved, remain on the glacier. Their families chose to leave them there, beneath the snow that preserved them, in the mountain that took them. A memorial was placed at the site. Simple. Stone. The names of the dead carved into permanence. Every year, the glacier moves, imperceptibly, a few meters. By geological time, those bodies are traveling, slowly, inexorably toward lower altitude. One day, decades from now, perhaps centuries, the glacier will release them. The mountain will return what it borrowed. Until then, the Andes hold them, in the cold and the silence, in the place where the sky is always close. There's a question that the story asks of everyone who encounters it. Not the question the tabloids asked in 1972, not the prurient, sensation-seeking question about what the survivors did to live. That question, though understandable, is the wrong question. It is too narrow, too focused on the specific and the sensational at the expense of the universal. The real question, the one that lives at the center of the story like a fire that never quite goes out, is this: what are you willing to do for the people you love? How far will you walk into the cold? How many impossible ridgelines will you climb, exhausted and terrified, before you accept that it cannot be done? These are not abstract questions. They are the questions that every human life poses, in smaller ways, on quieter mountains. The mother who sits by a hospital bed through a third sleepless night. The son who makes the call he has been avoiding for months. The friend who tells the truth when the lie would be so much easier. We all have our glaciers. We all have our moments when the rational choice is to turn back, and something in us, something older than reason, deeper than instinct, refuses. The 16 survivors of Flight 571 did not become mythological because they were extraordinary people. They became mythological because they reveal what ordinary people are capable of when everything ordinary is stripped away. And what remains is not weakness. What remains is this: the insistence of the human spirit to endure, to move, to reach across a roaring river on a scrap of torn paper and say, I am here. I am still here. Come find me. The mountains do not remember them. The glacier moves as it has always moved. The wind crosses the ridgelines with the same indifference it carried in October 1972, and in October 1872, and in October 10,000 years before that. The snow falls on a place where the fuselage once lay, and fills the hollow, and smooths the surface until there is no trace. Nature does not keep our stories. We keep them. We keep them because they are the maps by which we navigate our own impossible crossings. Because in the extremity of another person's experience, we find, sometimes with surprise, sometimes with recognition, a mirror. The world that Flight 571 departed has changed beyond all recognition. The Cold War has ended. Empires have risen and fallen. Technologies undreamed of in 1972 have reshaped every surface of human life. But the cold has not changed. The altitude has not changed. And the thing that kept 16 people alive on a glacier for 72 days, the thing that sent 2 men climbing into the unknown with no guarantee of anything, only the refusal to stop, that has not changed either. It has never changed. It is perhaps the oldest thing in us. And on the days when the world feels like a mountain, when the air thins, when the path disappears, when a rational voice inside you suggests that perhaps this is far enough, remember that somewhere on a glacier at 12,000 feet, a 19-year-old boy once looked at an impossible horizon and took one more step, just one more step,